Welcome to the Novel Idea Society. This is a welcome that is like 5 years late because we read your book, The Break, in 2018.
Wow.
So to come back and read The Circle is really special. So thank you for making time. I know you're super busy and you've got mom life and everything else. So I appreciate it.
I am so happy to be here. Yeah, I'm up late. My kids are upstairs. This is fun.
Okay, so this could be a pretty heavy conversation because your books are not light and fluffy. They have like comical moments, but you're not fluff by any means in the literary world. But you've written a lot, like not just these three books, but other things as well. When you wrote The Break, did you know that The Strangers in the Circle was coming, or is that something that just kind of you felt like had to follow?
Um, I kind of knew it more as just trying to adjust myself here, wondering how I'm looking. I picture that, oh, I can see myself on the big screen. Must make sure my angles are right.
You look great.
Thank you. When I started the break, I had no idea how to write a novel. I had no idea how to write prose of any kind. I was into poetry at the time, so it seemed like such a huge task to write a novel. So I was really just concentrating on that at the time. 2016 is when it was published. It did feel like a very tip of the iceberg story. I did feel like I knew the characters really well. I knew all their backstory, all of their lives. But I was really concentrating on the action of the break. The break itself is a very, I always call it a claustrophobic novel because it happens within about 4 days. It's all about in that peak of that traumatic episode. So it really made me pair off a lot of things and become just its own story. So all this pairing off was the backstory of Phoenix and Phoenix's family. And then I knew what happened after, which ended up going into the circle, but I wasn't sure how it was going to look at the time. So I did leave it. I sold it as an individual book, and then and the characters just hung around and still wanted to be shown. So I started writing The Circle, or sorry, wrong one, The Strangers, which I really wanted to be like this family saga and tell the history of a family. And then with that under my belt, I tried to undertake what would be The Circle. And I really had no idea how it was going to be when I started writing it. It was a lot of surprises. There's a lot of surprises throughout.
What was the most surprising to you?
Honestly, it was that I didn't want to revisit the characters like I did in The Break and The Strangers. With The Strangers especially, I had the four core characters, and even with The Break, there was seven main people, 10 altogether voices, and that I kept returning to. But with The Circle, it just I didn't want to. Um, I thought I was going to. It would be a similar kind of pattern. But I just felt like all these extra characters, all these seemingly secondary characters, just really felt like they wanted their chance to have an opportunity to talk about how this affected them. And it really started to mirror what ended up being the book, which is kind of like a restorative justice circle, right? Where everyone gets a chance to talk about how they are affected. And so many people were affected by these incidents. So then it became 21 different voices. And wasn't that fun? I actually had a really wonderful time doing that and developing the characters. It really was a for me kind of experience. Yeah.
How do you keep 21 characters straight?
With great difficulty and a lot of humility and a lot of messy. Whenever you're writing a novel, you kind of start off like, or at least when I write a novel, when I teach writing novels, I think it's pretty common. You start off with the gusto, like I'm gonna do this, like let's go. I have no idea what I'm doing, and every novel is absolutely its own thing. I never know what I'm doing. And that messy, murky middle part kind of almost drives you nuts. And I stayed in there for a really long time with this one. But in a way, it was kind of easier in a lot of ways because I was always revisiting new characters. I did have a through line, like it does happen chronologically. So there was a very through line that kind of kept me going and kind of kept me grounded. But I got to pick up whatever character struck my fancy and let them tell their pieces of the story.
One of the ladies in the book club asked on the Facebook page why you decided to include the family chart at the beginning. Was that something you did for yourself that just happened to make the book, or is that something you thought the reader might need?
I did think the reader might need it. I love really complicated character books. I love genealogies and maps. I'm a big high fantasy reader, so I really like that. Those appendices. I don't know how you say that word, but I like that stuff, right? So for the break, I had one genealogy for the strangers because it's a family story. It felt very obvious to have another genealogy. And then for the circle, because I had already had the genealogies, I call it a relational circle, we had the bubbles, and kind of how everyone's connected and how everyone's connected to other people. Um, I had a lot of fun making that just because it showed me where people were interconnected and the ones that were kind of on the fringes and outside. Yeah.
Where did you draw your stories from? Because I think there's so many different stories in those character lines, but I think back to the break, and then I read The Strangers right before I read The Circle because it's funny reading it. Everyone's like, you could just jump to The Circle. You don't need to read The Strangers, but it's helpful if you do. And I'd had it forever. So I was like, okay, I'm going to read this and read that. And every person has a unique story, as we all do as human beings, but they all seem very relatable or believable. Like these weren't things that were, oh, that would never happen to a person. Did you draw them from imagination? Did you draw them from stories of people you knew, things that happened in the news? Like there's any which place that these could come from, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think we all I never want to take from any individual person's story. Like on purpose, very deliberately. If I feel like any of my characters seem to linger toward someone I know or some story that I know is not mine to tell, especially, I stay away from it. I move over. I do love the beauty of fiction where I can craft it to how I want it. So there are some similarities, like the incident. I'm thinking of the incident with Bishop's partner, Angie Dumas. She works for a parliamentarian, and she talks about this incident that the MLA that she works for, something like that had happened to one of our parliamentary members. Or no, I guess that's a legislative member. Sorry. Um, so there's something similar that I know that might be familiar to people in Manitoba, something like that. But other than that, I really stayed far away from any story that I knew. I did want it to be its own thing. I always wanted these stories to be their own thing, and kind of the bigger story that happens in the circle and in the break. That's something that came. Obviously, I was influenced by many things, as we all are, but it needed to be its own thing.
Do you have a moment where that story of Phoenix came to you where you knew that this was going to be her story?
Phoenix is a character that's been with me for, oh, forever. Um, the break happened after probably about 10 years of writing that story, and not really knowing how. And I cannot stress enough how much I did not have any idea how to write a novel. Originally, the stories were in a short story collection that I used for my master's thesis. So there was some stories of Phoenix, and even those took a really long time to get into print. She was just a character that kind of hung around on the edges and wanted to talk. Um, so I did know her story. I did know how it was the overarching arc of it. I was familiar with, and it was just what I was gonna show and how. It took me a long time to figure out how I wanted to write that because on the surface, it's a really hard story, as you say, and there's a lot of really heavy things that are in the story, but I didn't want to tell it with heaviness, and I definitely didn't want to tell it in any way that exploited stories like that because I was looking for um, I was looking for, I was questioning the why and the how things like that can happen. But I also wanted to show the strength and the beauty in the people that it was happening to. That I was really guided by this idea that I love, that we're not the worst thing that's ever happened to us. We're not the worst thing we've ever done. We're human beings, and none of these things ever happen in vacuums. We're whole people with whole histories that come into these things, come into these situations and create these situations sometimes. And though we're always accountable for our actions, there's people are just so freaking interesting. They're abound with characteristics and traits and kind of the pieces of how we put ourselves together. I'm forever fascinated by
You give people so much grace. Where does that come from?
that.
Do you
Fiction.
have a good therapist?
I have a really good therapist. I have a real, and I actually credit my therapist. I have a new book coming out, and I was like, I have to thank her because so much of this book is about her. Um, and other therapists I've had in the past. I've also been really lucky. I know some really amazing people, and amazing, imperfect, sometimes troubled, definitely many people traumatized in one way or another, but that's not the whole thing of who they are. Some of the best situations happen in the most horrible circumstances. These places where people come together and really show their love of one another, show their humor to one another. Like it's never one thing. It's never ever one thing, and I love seeing that.
So you wrote The Break having no idea what you were doing and had massive success with it. What was that like for you going? Because I mean, you also would have no idea what to expect in terms of um, how it does in stores and with readers. So I'm wondering, that book does massively well. What kind of feedback did you get on that story? Because that is the crux that leads everything else off, but it's also probably the hardest one to read.
It is the hardest one to read, and I purposely don't want to make another book as hard as The Break ever again. Because it was hard for me to write tech in a very technical way, and learning how to craft it, but also the content of it was so heavy. So in a way, The Strangers is that much lighter, and The Circle is that much lighter. Not that we're not getting into lightness, and but we're getting there, and it's also a different way for me to write it. I feel like there was a lot of things I was discovering and writing through in The Break, and lessons that I learned. So I really wrote things differently as I went on. I had no idea The Break was going to do anything. Like I was convinced up until the date of publication. I was convinced that it was going to, and I kind of am every time a book comes out. Like I'm convinced I'm going to be run out of town. There's going to be pitchforks and torches involved. And everyone's going to be like, this is why would you even do this? Particularly with all the content that was in The Break. But that I think I'm glad in the end it took me so long to write it, because I really needed to write it in a way that I was proud of it, in a way that I found the answers. I started writing about the hows and the whys, and I found answers in there, and I wrote them in there. So I hope that people read them in there. And I did the same process through with The Strangers, and with The Circle, especially really coming into this place of answering those questions for myself, so that even if I do get run out of town one day with pitchforks and torches, then I at least know that I tried my very best with the story that I had, for whatever reason. Oh,
I'm muting myself because I have you
okay.
cranked up. So much of Indigenous fiction right now that's having a moment, because there really is a moment, is based around mythology and folklore, or like horror stories. Yours is very much more, even though it's fiction, more real. What kind of feedback do you get from people who are reading your books and the stories about these very complicated human beings?
Um, Yeah, I mean, we are having a moment, and I honestly think like Indigenous fiction is some of the most exciting things are happening in Indigenous fiction. And it is mythology. There is so much happening in different genres. I have a cat visiting me right now. She's gonna make her
We
appearance.
are
This is
happy to say hello. You are welcome to introduce your cat.
Gilbert. This is Gilbert. Gilbert is 19. She gets to go wherever the hell she wants.
At 19, you can do what you want when you're a cat.
She can do whatever she wants. She's gonna like get her fur all over me. I'm gonna have an allergic reaction, but yeah,
Oh.
she's my Gilbert. And she's kicking pretty hard for 19. So, um, where was I? What were we talking about?
Feedback, having a moment.
Um, the feedback, I'm not on social media. I do that by design. For my own sanity and well-being. And I don't read reviews of my book. I kind of live in this bubble and I'm surrounded by people who help me live in this bubble where I'm like, I so I keep myself really safe from that. Um, but so what ends up getting through my bubble is positive things and ways in which people maybe have enjoyed the books and maybe have, helped them in whatever way, the way fiction, helps us. I don't think I do anything special. I think we love stories of other people. We love getting into and getting to know people different from ourselves or similar to ourselves. That validation of humanness is kind of why we read and why I read. And I think we all really love that. So yeah, I'm kind of surrounded by the good vibes over here when it comes to that.
That's awesome. So when you're writing, let's talk about writing structure. Are you a plotter that has full structure planned out, you know where you're going from start to finish and you just have to fill in the blanks? Or do you fly by the seat of your pants?
I am somewhere in between those two. I am not a fly by the seater I'm kind of a fly by the seat, but I got a plan. I always know a place to start. Um, but I don't know where I'm going necessarily when I start. And I like to write as far as I can with that kind of mood for as long as I can. There always comes a point where you need to sit down and like, I always call it the macro view. We have to pan out, we have to see where things are going because it's getting confusing in here. But I do like to kind of stay in that zone for as long as possible because that's where the magic happens. I had a writing teacher years ago, a very wonderful Manitoba writer named David Arneson. And I remember sitting in a writing class with him and he said, I never want to write the story that I know the end to. And so something in me really kept that. And sometimes I know the end and I have no idea how I got there. But most of the time I don't know where I'm going. And even when I do know the end, like for The Strangers, I knew where it was ending. But as I got to know all these characters, I didn't know Margaret, for instance, the curmudgeon old, very reluctant matriarch who made so many mistakes. I didn't know she would have such an integral role and that um, what she did directly impacted like Cedar and Phoenix and Elsie's lives in such a big way. I thought I was just writing a curmudgeon old lady, and I really had fun with that because I got all my anger out. Margaret was written at the beginning of the pandemic, and I had just had a baby and all my family was stuck in my house, so I was just the angry old lady, doing her puzzles. I was like, let's get all this out here. That's where I started. But she ended up being what she did, just kind of made everything made sense. So, I didn't know that. I didn't know how much that would happen. So that's the magic part. I love that part. I love kind of just, yeah, going as far as I can. But then at a certain point, you do have to like pay attention to plots. And because I have so many storylines going, I kind of dissect them. I take each storyline out. This is Gilbert going wherever the heck she wants. Um, but yeah, I kind of take them out one at a time and make sure that they make sense individually. I always tend to get too many characters involved. My joke is always when trouble with the plot, just add a new character. What could go wrong? But yeah, it's kind of figuring out where everything goes and then kind of putting it back together like a puzzle. So I spend a lot of time doing things like that. And then when I get to the final stages of editing, I'm a big polisher. I polish the heck out of everything and I try to make sense of every little part. I still end up being really messy and typos still end up being like everywhere, but I do spend a lot of time just that's the poet in me, right? I have to make sure every line is the way I want it at the time, you know. And then the next time I read it, I want to change it again and I can't apparently, but you know, one of these days I'll do it.
That's amazing. How many people do you show your work to as you're writing? Is that something that you hold close to your chest, or do you let other people kind of see things as they're developing?
I it depends. With this not many. Not many at all until the end. I do keep it really close to me. I like to know what it is before I have any other voices, which is totally different. Like something like The Break, because I wrote so many of those initial stories in grad school, some of those stories were workshopped to death, you know, as what happens in grad school. You just workshop that over and over again. But then other parts were completely new, and some parts only my agent and my editor would have seen until the end. Um, so I do keep a lot of things really close for a long time until I figure it out. But I might share some kind of pieces and, you know, in my new book, I had originally had like this historical piece and I wasn't sure how to write a historical piece because writing anything historical is very intimidating because you have to get all those facts right. And I'm a poet. I get nothing right. I just kind of, you know, wander
No
away.
artistic license with history, right?
Yes, exactly. I wander away from the points of like of facts and dates. Gosh. Um, so I did get someone to review those things because I wanted to make sure I was speaking what actually happened and not just what I think happened. But I didn't end up even using that in the end. But then once I get to kind of the finishing editing stages, that's when I ask people to read, and I really want to get opinions and change things. Um, at the last minute. I do have a group of great, I call them my coven, my little coven who always reads my stuff and they always tell me I'm awesome. So I'm like, thanks. That's all I needed to hear. Let's
I
move
like your
on.
coven. That sounds like a good coven to be a part
Yeah,
of.
it's all magic. It's all magic.
Um, it's interesting as you read through Canadian fiction, Indigenous or not. So much of it is set in Ontario.
Mm,
Uh, but I know that that's where a lot of authors live or think they have to live to get published. You still live in Manitoba.
yeah.
Manitoba's kind of a character in your stories. You haven't set them elsewhere. Why is that important to you?
I think originally like it kind of started here. And I mean, with this trilogy, and it's not a trilogy, it's interconnected novels. I shouldn't call it a trilogy, but these three novels definitely take place in a certain place. And that started with The Break and my first collection of poetry, well, my two collections of poetry. It's a great place. I think that it's an underserved literary place. And I'm talking about like the North End, I'm talking about Winnipeg, I'm talking about Manitoba, you know, different parts around, primarily southern Manitoba. I don't kind of venture that far north. Um, it is what I know, but it's also what I love, you know, and I don't think writers should write what they know. I think they should always write what they love. I do love this place. I've always had a complicated relationship with this place. Never wanted to be here when I was a kid, you know, tried to get away so bad, you know, it kept pulling me back in like the mob. So I ended up setting up my adult life here. But we have such a fantastic history. And, you know, my people, especially like Michif people in the Red River, like, you know, we kind of ruled this place. We kind of still do, arguably, but whatever. But so I love that. I love bringing that forward and sharing that. Because I think it gives me a lot of joy. But also I think that it is the character that I know. And I think place is so very important. And I think too often writers are advised, or by their own volition, want to write kind of a vague place. We're advised, especially if we want to become commercial successes, to give kind of a vague place that kind of looks like the US, because the US really likes to see itself, right? So we have to place our stories in the US. Um, I really, I really pushed against that, because I would never write from, say, someone else's territory, because as an Indigenous person, if I write from someone else's territory, they're completely different people from me. They have a completely different history, and I would be imposing myself upon them, as opposed to here, where I feel a sense of home territory, and I feel a sense of place and belonging, and there, everything is very specific to here. Um, that's my favorite kind of stories, when we're specific to the place and we recognize that our place is actually so very important to who we are. Like, we're literally made of our place. We breathe the air and the water. Like, we're constructed of our place, but we're also like a product of, all the idiosyncrasies of our particular city or community, right? It would be different elsewhere.
It's interesting that you say that, because I feel like Wa Bryce said something very similar about Sudbury and the books that he wrote, where the place is also very much a character in his books as well.
Yeah.
But you being in Winnipeg makes you kind of a rock star on the prairies, because there are not, like, you've got Jessica Johns in Alberta and
Yes, we
you in Manitoba. I don't know that we have any. Well, we got Michelle Good in
got
Saskatchewan,
Michelle Good,
so
yeah.
you've got like the Prairie Trilogy there.
Yeah.
I
I've
know when we did Bad Cree with Jessica back, I think in January, and we talked a little bit about the community of writers. And it seems that Canadian authors have a little, I don't call it a club, but I feel like Canadian authors know each other really well. But I feel like Indigenous Canadian authors have their own club, and that you guys are very supportive of each other's work. And very supportive when things come out. Do you also bounce ideas off of each other, or do you keep those to yourself?
Um, I mean, I know a lot of people that I not necessarily bounce ideas off of, but we might like have discussions, and discussions would lead to something else. Um, Michelle, for instance, Michelle and I were in the UBC together. So we have workshopped each other's stories. We were actually like, there's a crazy fun fact of trivia. We met in a writing class led by Joseph Boyden. So that's its own interesting little tidbit of
I have
information.
so many questions I could ask you about that.
There's so many things. It's so much fun. That was actually also the other gossipy part of that was during Stephen Galloway's tenure at the UBC. So we were right in the thick of it.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and it was a very interesting time in Canadian, and I don't mean to bring up names to be anything other than.
No, 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 not at all. But it's also relatable to people too, right? They know who you're
Yeah,
talking
I
about.
mean, it was a very different time in Canlit, because it was just a time when things were so very different, and there were so few Indigenous writers being published at a certain level. There were so few BIPOC writers being published at a certain level, like absolutely no queer writers. I say that, but there's going to be like that one that I forgot. So it was a very different moment to be coming in and trying our hand at being writers, because there was this idea, we did it because we loved it. We actually had no ambition to get above a certain point, because we were prairie writers, because we were writing from a very what was then called a niche subject matter. And whether or not it is niche, I think it's specific rather than niche, and I think we all should talk about specificity, because there's universality in the specific, but whatever. But things have grown so much since then. And I love that I'm in an era where I don't know all the Indigenous writers coming out with books. Like there was a time when we had a handful and we rooted for them and we were just like, yes, let's go. We're going to put all our power behind whatever our power we have. We're going to put behind these people because we want them to be successful and we want them to shine. And now there's so many, and I'm so excited. Like there's young people. I was hanging out with Billy Ray Balcour and Joshua Whitehead last week at an event for Billy Ray's new book, Coexistence, which is absolutely glorious. I was just talking with Richard Van Camp the other day and reading his new book. I love this. I love that these books are popping out all over the place. I love that people have these rich bodies of work. Someone like Richard, who's been at it forever, he has like something like 50 books in the world. That's amazing. I love that. I love reading his books. It's like coming home to a fictional place I've never had the pleasure of being actually in, but I go there all the time with his stories. I love that. I mean,
It's funny you say that because I had reached out maybe last year or the year before to Thomas King to see if he was interested to be part of the book club. And he said while he was flattered, he declined because there were so many new great Indigenous authors that he didn't want to take up the space and he wanted to make room for somebody else. And I thought that that was such a lovely, like that he just wanted to make that space for other people because he has such a huge backlog of amazing books. But we've done so many Indigenous authors this year, and just because they're popular fiction, like it's not that we're picking them necessarily because it's an Indigenous author. It's because the story looks really good and we got something to talk about.
exactly. And there's so many things to talk about that have to do with culture or are rooted in culture and this is like they're rooted in place. But these are universal things. These are human things.
And I think too, like being on the prairies, there's so much as a white person growing up around Indigenous people, reading these stories also helps me understand so much of the things I grew up around that I didn't even know was happening. Like whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it just gives you a greater appreciation for the people that you grew up around that you maybe didn't ask questions about. You were just like, well, that's the way they do things.
Well, it's kind of by design, right? The prairies were designed this way to kind of keep us all separate and in our little silos, kind of like not trusting one another and not knowing what the other person was doing. And as a part in BIPOC groups, we always knew what the white mainstream was doing because that was something we were given just like everyone else.
We just tell you.
Yeah, exactly. But now we have all of these different people from all of these different worlds that intersect with our world. And it's so lovely to know what they're doing, what they're thinking, what that one particular author is knowing and doing and thinking, what
Mhm.
they see. Because seeing the world from a different angle, seeing your world from a different angle. I'm thinking here of Casey Platt, the work of Casey Platt. I love Casey Platt. She's my Mennonite cousin in some way on my Mennonite side. We haven't quite figured out exactly how, but we got some.
The girl who loves genealogy hasn't figured it out yet.
We'll figure it out. Mennonites have so many kids, so you can't trace them all back. There's like families with like 13 kids. But anyway, my cousin Casey Platt, I love her world. Her world is intertwined with Winnipeg often. And it's so it looks like my world. It feels familiar in my world, but it's totally different. It's a complete
Mhm.
vantage point and a whole bunch of things that look familiar, but then take me on a different path. It's magic.
Tell me about this new book. When is it coming out? What is it called? What's it about? I'm guessing it's not part of the interconnected, you don't want to call a trilogy.
It's not a trilogy, it's interconnected novels. And it's really interesting because some people have told me that they don't read it in like the break, the strangers, the circle, they read it out of sync. So it's like it's a choose your own adventure of
Of
trauma.
really sad things. Choose your own trauma novel? Is that what you
Your
basically
own
just
trauma.
described it as?
It's the thing. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Um, so my new one is called Real Ones. It comes out in September. It is a standalone novel. It's not connected with the trilogy and the art and the story arc in the not trilogy at all. But they are stranger sisters. So it's another stranger family. So in The Strangers, for those who have read The Strangers, there's Joseph's son, Jerome. And then when Cedar is, these are all the Easter eggs here. When Cedar is looking for her family, she finds a professor named June Stranger and a artist named Lynn Stranger. Very not unimportant to The Strangers as a book, but those are the characters that I've now taken up with to do another story. So it's Lynn and June. They're professional midship women, and their mother is outed as a pretendian. So their mother, their white mother, is assumes this identity as an Indigenous person and then is called out for it. So
I
it's
have,
about
I have to ask how you feel about all of this. Like, you can't just drop pretendian in front of me and not expect me to ask. So, I mean, how do you frame that in a novel when this is something, I mean, I work at CBC. Jeff Leo has done an extensive work on it, but also I noticed a couple weeks ago Canada Land is doing a whole podcast series on it. So people are paying attention. So how do you write this into a novel when it's also nonfiction?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to take, again, I never want to take from any particular story. This is a very, again, I wanted to take it's an individual story. It's something happening very intra a family. So it's literally a mother who is taking from her, ex-husband and her children. So it's a very direct line. So I didn't want to get anyone else involved. I wanted to talk about the emotional labor, the mental labor, and the intellectual weight that happens to Indigenous people when we're faced with these issues, when we're faced with yet another threat to our cultural sovereignty, in so many ways. And there's so many things about race shifting and all of the many things that are happening around that. To me, this story ended up being a really small story in all of that. Um, and of course, I started writing and talking about this issue because this is something we have talked about a lot, like in amongst my Indigenous colleagues and friends, and in amongst my, non-Indigenous colleagues and friends. And I felt like this was something I was confronted with over and over. So it really started as me just thinking about the issue and how it affects me and how it affects so many of us, when we constantly have to explain, especially, I wanted it to be a Michif story because so often with Michif people, Métis people, we're kind of this gateway, that is so easily accessed by people race shifting onto our culture. And there's so many misunderstandings about our culture, so it ends up being, these someone in my personal experience, always growing up, knowing who I am, yet still having the identity issue, yet still having to explain who I am. And now now someone's trying to take that and give their own definition to it, right? So it's about that. I wanted it to be about the sisters. I wanted it to be about the Midship sisters and how this affects them and not anything else. But yeah.
That sounds so good. Like, that sounds really interesting.
Well, let's see. I also think authors are the worst at synopsizing their books. So what I
It's
think
not going to be about that at all. That's just one
yeah,
chapter.
exactly. It's just something totally about. And of course, there's always the family dynamics, and I like to talk about, um, how we're built. We're built with these little building blocks from our childhood traumas and our childhood strengths and our beauties and our talents. I want to talk about these. I built a couple new characters and then they get to deal with this and they're very equipped to deal with this. So,
Okay, I could ask you questions all night, but I want to open it up to all of these lovely people who logged on and got very excited when I told them that you were coming tonight. So we have a few. Are there any questions in the room? I don't have my fancy webcam that I normally have hooked up. Do any of you have a question in the room? You can shake your heads. Any questions? No questions in the room. Okay. On the interwebs, if you have questions, just put up your little hand. There's a button, or unmute yourself, and I will see you've unmuted yourself, and you can ask a question or feedback. Just remember she likes the nice things.
Like, you can tell me the negative things too. I mean, the bad things. I can take it. I'm really tough.
I'm really tough. Really tough. I think the only thing from your books that I just find them hard, like sometimes they're just hard to read because it's, I mean, as someone who lives in the news space,
Hmm.
um, I can find nuggets of truth in stories that we've shared for the, like I've been doing this almost 20 years, and I
Hmm.
could probably find a nugget in every single book that is relatable to something that's happened to the experience of a woman anywhere on the prairies, like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or Alberta. Not that that's a unique experience to the prairies, but it felt very relatable to the prairie experience.
Yeah,
Does no
that's
one have questions? Are you scared of her? This is very odd. Normally we have people wanting to speak.
the opposite of scary.
You're
I
very much the opposite of scary. Colleen usually has something she'd like to say, not to put Colleen on the spot.
Oh, poor Colleen. I'm sorry, Colleen. I will say that about feedback, and that's kind of one of the that sad things that came out of feedback is that I was often asked, particularly about the break and about the strangers, oh, did you get this story from this particular incident or something that happened in Winnipeg? And I, as recently as last year, I remember someone brought up a different story that was very similar to the break. Um, and these are stories, of course, I had no idea about. And that's what makes it kind of sad that these
Yeah.
that you know it is such and then the strangers I knew that it was quite a common experience, you know, foster systems and you know apprehensions happen so very frequently, sadly. Um but there are so many other things that I didn't realize were, you know, so as far as much as I tried to stay away from any of the stories I knew, I ended up tapping into stories that I didn't know. Um, but in that too, I kind of, you know, my characters survived and so many of them thrive, you know. So in that way, you know, I always try to end on that hopeful note, you know, that, you know, bring it up. You know, I had um a storyteller and a traditional storyteller friend of mine very early on in my career talk about how uh, our job as storytellers is to not, you know, is to tell the truth. And the truth sometimes is hard. But we're never there to lead people into the dark places and leave them there. We always have to show them a way through. So I really hope to do that in my novels. That's my goal to like, we might be going through some dark places, but we're always getting to the other side. And that's always my goal. Oh, I think you're muted.
Everyone is muted, including me. Colleen says, I haven't had a chance to read The Circle yet, but I'm going to start it right away, which is why she hasn't said anything. But she loved and put like stars, loved The Break and The Strangers.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you. That's very kind.
She says, I also really liked your comment on the validation of humanness.
Oh, cool. Did I just say that now?
So you're teaching people how to write now. You've gone from not knowing how to write a novel to teaching.
I have taught for several years, yeah.
How
Um,
is that going? What's that process like? Fostering young minds and older minds too.
Young minds, all the writerly minds. I do teach a lot of fiction now. I did teach poetry before I knew how to write a novel. I love writing. I love teaching. I love mentorship way more than teaching because teaching a class is hard, as anyone who teaches a class knows.
My
Um,
gosh, I agree with that so much.
it is so hard to make a lesson plan and try to fit everybody into it, right? But I love mentorship. And I whenever it fits into my schedule, I like to do mentorships because it's really just getting to know that particular writer, getting to know that particular work, and really just craft, you know, talking about craft and talking about where stories come from and really figuring out what's going to work and if I have any tools. I'm a big reader too, so I always like to give reading lists and like, oh, you should read this. Oh, you should read that. Whether or not people do, I don't know. But I just, it's like I love giving people books that they might want, whether they want it or not.
I very much identify with everything you just said. Colleen would like to know how your Mennonite heritage factors into your writing, or if it does at all.
Um, Here and there, I tend to write kind of some secondary Mennonite characters. I feel like I'm a person who grew up in a very indigenous life. I grew up in the city. I grew up identifying as a Michif person. Um, my mother has like hasn't lived in a Mennonite town for my entire life, since well before my life began. So it was always, and when I went to a lot of, I never identified it as a Mennonite person the same way I did as a Métis person. Um, just because there was a obvious difference that kind of came into those things. And though there's many things about the culture and the people and my loved ones, of course, that I love, it's been a very different learning process because I wasn't immersed in it. I feel like I've been looking, like in the last few years, especially, I've been looking into Mennonite history and the immigration and the many beleaguered immigrations that the Mennonite people went through, and some fascinating history just about like just the I love the Reformation right now. This is my history geek era. I love the Reformation. Is that what it's called? Yeah, the Reformation and the Anabaptist rising of the Anabaptist movement, the Munster Rebellion. Did you know this about Mennonites? The Munster Rebellion is nuts.
No, but
Um,
all my family I have a bunch of family in Munster in Saskatchewan, so that sounds right
oh
up my
my gosh.
alley.
Okay. The Mennonite Munster Rebellion. I know there's like Menno Simon himself, had nothing to do with the Munster Rebellion and hated it at the time. But it's just they were freaks. I love that. I relate to the freakiness. Um, so who knows? It all comes out in one way or another, but it's definitely been a different relational for myself, and that's my own personal journey, and that's how it comes out in writing, right? It always comes out. It's always my own journey. So who knows?
She says thank you, and even though she hadn't read it yet, she didn't want to miss hearing you talk tonight. So
Thank you.
people were excited. Okay, I don't want to keep you much longer because I know you're an hour later than we are. You said you read high fantasy. Are you in the cult of Sarah Maas?
No.
Sarah J. Maas, you have not read a Court of Thorn and Roses?
My daughter is reading that. I think she's on like the last book.
How old is your daughter?
That daughter is 25.
Okay. Okay. I was like, these are not YA novels. Read them and join the cult. That will be
Okay,
my recommendation to you.
all right. Awesome.
And she's got like several series, but they're quick reads and they're enjoyable. What would you tell us to read since you love to give lists? What's the best book you've read lately, and then you can recommend some other ones.
Okay, I just read Billy Ray Balcourt's Coexistence, which is out now, I think. I highly recommend Billy Ray. Billy Ray is kind of doing, I call it the Manawakaing that we all do. I'm creating it with kind of my version of Winnipeg. He's kind of doing it with Northern Alberta. Richard Van Camp does it with Fort Simmer, which is Fort Smith in Northwest Territories, Manawaka after Margaret Lawrence, right? So he's creating this town and this community. So coexistence connects with, but minor chorus, but of course they're all very standalone, and as well with his poetry and stuff. So I'm really excited about what he does. What else? I just breeze through. I'm also, my reading list is like 10 years too late in some ways because I can't keep up and I kind of go wherever I want to. So I've been reading
Yep.
a lot. I just read, speaking of the Munster Rebellion, I read the Taylor King,
Okay.
which is a history of the Munster Rebellion. I read that recently. Great book. I just plowed through The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. It's his memoir. Came out 10 years ago, embarrassingly enough. But for some reason, someone said, no, I think it was Billy Ray. He would have recommended it. And I read it like in a day, and I love those books. You know, that somewhere between poetry and memoir and just like, it's just delicacies, right? So I did that. What else? I love Bad Creep, but you already read that.
Mhm.
Amanda Peters.
Oh
Amanda
my
Peters.
God, that was like the best book of last year. She's winning all the awards. I loved it
All the
so
awards.
much. And we
Yes.
did her book too, and I just loved her. And it was right after she won the first award, and they just keep coming. And it's just, it was,
Coming.
I hope she writes so many more books because I know that was only her first book, but it was my favorite book of last year.
Yeah. She did exceptional. She just won another award like today.
Of
Uh,
course she did.
she texted me like today, and she just texts me all this stuff. I used to be her mentor back
Yes,
in,
I was like, I knew you were connected to someone because
yeah,
she was excited you were coming too because she had said that you were her mentor. So we had talked about it when we booked you.
yes. But the book I worked on her with, taking absolutely no credit for her wondrousness. I have to get that. I just like to be, like I told her, like, I just want a bumper sticker saying I mentored Amanda Peters. Like I'm a proud parent
Proud
of
mom, proud book mom.
an honor student, it's like proud former mentor of Amanda Peters. She has a collection of stories coming out in the fall too. Which that's what we worked on. Kind of, it happened actually before Berry Kickers, or yeah, whatever. Beautiful stories, absolutely. Like she is again bringing in the Mi'kmaq and really making it come alive. And I love that because I do think Mi'kmaq and the East Coast in general is something. When you look thinking about Indigenous literature in Canada, it has been very highly underrepresented. You know, in the prairies, we're kind of lucky because population wise, it kind of just makes sense. But we have a lot of writers in the prairies and from Ontario, as you said.
Mhm.
But yeah, the East
Okay.
Coast is going to rise up. You know,
Mhm. Well, on that note, thank you so much for this. I know that you have a million things on the go, and this was so fun, and we could talk forever because I feel like we like a lot of the same books. But that is not the purpose of the book club, even though I would like it to be. But I feel like everyone here got so much out of this tonight. And just thank you so much for your time and for the books, and we will watch for the new one in September.
well, thank you, and thank you for the recommendation. I will get cracking on my daughter's collection.
Join the cult. And then if you hate it, I didn't recommend it.
All right, for sure. No, it's okay. I love cults. I'll join any cult.
Oh yeah. Well, once you start talking about it, not that you're not on social media, so now it's not going to fill your social media, but everyone else, sorry not sorry, it's going to be all over your social media now.
Okay. I look
Thanks so
forward to
much.
it. All right, you take care. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Have a lovely night. Thank you.